You clock out, you go home. For a few hours, nobody owns your time. Now imagine that feeling didn't exist for you at all. Not on any day. Not ever. Except for a handful of hours between sunset and sunrise. For millions of enslaved people in the American South, the night wasn't rest. It was the only sliver of the day that wasn't stolen, and what they built inside those few hours is far stranger and far more remarkable than most history classes ever mention. The daylight hours of slavery are the ones most commonly taught. The fields, the labor, the violence, the total control an enslaver held over a person's body and time. But historians who study this era closely point to something else. Something that unfolded almost entirely out of sight of the plantation house. After dark, a second world came alive. Enslaved people called it, in later memory, simply the quarters. But historian Albert Rabateau gave it a more precise name, the invisible institution. Invisible, because it had to be. Anything built in those hours only survived by staying hidden from the people who claimed ownership over every other part of enslaved life. Start with worship. Enslavers frequently permitted, even required, church attendance during the day. Sermons chosen and delivered by white ministers, often preaching obedience as scripture. But at night, in cabins, in brush arbors cut into the woods, enslaved communities held their own services. No supervision, no approved sermon. These gatherings had a name whispered among the enslaved themselves, the hush harbor. The word hush wasn't decorative. Voices were kept low. Lookouts were posted. Wet quilts and overturned pots were sometimes used to muffle sound, so a joyful hymn couldn't be heard from the main house. Inside those gatherings, something happened that daylight never allowed. A version of Christianity read on the community's own terms, one that emphasized Moses leading an enslaved people out of bondage far more than it emphasized obedience to a master. Night was also when families existed as families. Marriages between enslaved people held no legal standing and could be dissolved at any moment by sale. But at night, in cabins, parents told children the family's real history. Names, origins, sometimes fragments of African languages and songs that plantation life tried to erase during the day. Night was when skills were passed on outside of an enslaver's control. Quilting circles doubled as information networks. Storytelling, the Baja rabbit tales among them, taught children how a small, powerless creature could outwit a larger, stronger one through wit alone. Children raised in daylight terror were, at night, being trained in a completely different lesson. Cleverness beats force, and night was when plans were made. Historians studying the Underground Railroad note that nearly all movement happened after dark, using the North Star and word-of-mouth routes passed hand to hand. Spirituals sung in daylight fields sometimes carried a second coded meaning at night. A song about crossing the River Jordan could also mean crossing the Ohio River, and everyone who needed to know knew. Here's the detail that surprises most people. Enslavers were often aware that something happened at night in the quarters, and in many cases, they tolerated it. Not out of kindness, out of self-interest. A plantation ran more efficiently. Many enslavers believed if enslaved people were given some outlet, some illusion of a life of their own, rather than none at all. Absolute control, some slaveholders reasoned, bred more resistance, not less. So the night existed in a strange, brutal contradiction, partly tolerated because it made bondage more sustainable for the enslaver, and simultaneously, the one space enslaved people transformed into something the system never intended, a rehearsal space for dignity, for family, for a self that daylight refused to let them have. The very thing meant to make slavery function longer became the thing that preserved the culture, the faith, and the resistance networks that would eventually help end it. You still know this instinct, even if the stakes could never compare. The version of yourself that shows up in a room where nobody is grading you. The conversation that only happens once the supervisor leaves. The quiet hour where you finally feel like you, not like the role you performed all day. That instinct, to build something real in whatever hours aren't being watched, is not new. It is one of the oldest human responses to being controlled. Find the smallest gap the system leaves open and pour a whole culture into it. The people who built hush harbors in the dark did not have the luxury of choosing whether to resist. but in choosing what to build in those stolen hours. Worship, family, memory, escape. They made something that outlasted the system built to erase it. You clock out, and for a few hours, nobody owns your time. For them, the night was smaller than that, and it had to be hidden, and it was never safe. But it was theirs, and it's the reason so much of what they carried survived at all.